Hi everyone, that is Old Faithful Geyser, which has just erupted. That is Old Faithful Lodge, and welcome on another one of our virtual Yellowstone tours. Today I'll be taking you down from Old Faithful to Grotto Geyser. The trail on the left will lead you to Blue Star Spring and a rather nice overlook of bacteria mats of the Firehole River before landing up at the Old Faithful Inn parking lot. But this trail that I'm on now is going to take us over the Firehole River in a minute, and then we basically have a choice of three different trails that we can take, as I'm going to show you in a minute. That's the Firehole River on my right, and I'll shortly be coming to a bridge that goes over the Firehole. And when I do, if I go immediately to the right, as you'll see in a minute, and there's the bridge that I was referring to, the Firehole River, as I've told you guys many times in our virtual Yellowstone tours, is mainly a thermal river. In other words, a lot of the water in the Firehole River comes from thermal features, which are to be found, of course, all over Yellowstone, and particularly in the Upper Geyser Basin, which is where I am at the moment. Just think about this fact. Yellowstone contains approximately half of the world's geysers. And in this area where I am at the moment, at the Upper Geyser Basin, in this about 1 square mile area, there are no less than 150 geysers located. And coming up on the right is the turnoff to the trail that goes to an observation point to an overlook of Old Faithful from high up, and you can see that in another one of our virtual Yellowstone tours in our YouTube channel. And that also takes you on a pretty decent sized loop that continues on to Solitary Geyser, and that is well worth a visit. There's going to be a fork in the trail coming up. If I were to continue straight, that trail would bring me down from the hill that you see there after you've seen Solitary Geyser, but rather than continuing straight, I'm going to carry on this trail, and that is Sulphide Springs coming up on my right. I'm going to continue straight on this trail, which will eventually bring me out at Grotto Geyser, which can also be found on the main trail that runs between Old Faithful and Morning Glory. And as I say, that is the main trail in the Upper Geyser Basin, the one that most people take. Coming up on my left is Anemone Geyser, one of many geysers that are to be found in this part of Yellowstone. In fact, why don't I drop in a map of the area so you can see just where we are. I'll drop in a map, and this is Anemone, by the way. I'm going to drop in a map over here so you can see where we are relative to Yellowstone, and also where we are with relation to the rest of the Upper Geyser Basin. Please go to the following one of our sites, and you can see the maps to which I was referring. If you go to yellowstonetours.net/map, that's yellowstonetours.net/map, you can see the park map. You'll notice that the Upper Geyser Basin is located on Yellowstone's lower loop in the southwest corner, or the bottom left, and then on a map over the Upper Geyser Basin, we'll be traveling from the bottom right, where Old Faithful is, to Grotto Geyser, which was at the top left. This is Plume Geyser, a smaller geyser, but it erupts approximately every 20 minutes or so. So if you hang around for a while, when you're in the Upper Geyser Basin area, you may be lucky enough to see it erupt. That's not Plume there. Plume was just slightly behind me. And then coming up shortly on my left these are bacteria mats, and I'll talk to you a little bit more about bacteria mats as we proceed on this virtual Yellowstone tour. Now, that is Beehive Geyser. You can see Beehive erupting in another one of our virtual Yellowstone tours. Beehive is not one of the geysers whose eruption times are predicted. Its intervals in the summer range from anywhere from about 16 or 17 hours all the way out to about a day, and then in the winter the eruptions are very erratic and can't really be predicted. But it is a lovely geyser to watch. It has this beautiful thin cone, and as you saw, it was a cone geyser, so you get this very directed flow of water, which, if the wind is blowing sort of from the Old Faithful Inn area, blows the water back over the boardwalk, drenching everyone. And it also creates a rather delightful rainbow, as you can see in one of our virtual Yellowstone tours on Beehive erupting. And once again, please go to virtualyellowstonetours.com. That's virtualyellowstonetours.com. I was talking a moment ago about bacteria mats, and we see some more coming up ahead of me on the right. What happens is when the thermal water is right at the center of the thermal feature, like a hot spring, it's incredibly hot, and there's very few organisms that are able to live there. And that, by the way, at the background that we saw for a moment was the Lion Group of Geysers, and we'll get closer to it shortly. But that's the Lion Group in the middle there. As the waters leave the thermal area, so they cool down. This is Hot Spring coming up, and I'm sure you can see why it got the name. I was telling you that as the waters leave the thermal area, so they start to cool down, and more organisms and more bacteria are able to live in the waters. That's the Lion Group once again. So with more and more organisms being able to live in the waters flowing off the thermal features, so the bacteria mats become more and more colorful. And it really does make a really delightful sight all over Yellowstone, as you've seen in our other virtual Yellowstone tours. Now that's the trail that I'm going to be taking on the left to head down towards Grotto Geyser. But if I were to continue right up there, that leads us to where the trail from Solitary Geyser comes down. And you may recall a few minutes ago I had told you about the trail that you can take up to that overlook of Old Faithful Geyser, which is located on Geyser Hill. You can walk all the way up to the overlook. It's really quite incredible because you can see in those trees up there, in 1 minute you are right in the hustle and bustle and the crowds of the Upper Geyser Basin and Old Faithful, and then just a couple of minutes later you can be by yourself in the middle of these forests, just experiencing absolute peace and tranquility with nobody anywhere near you. Now, I know from having done this trail before that there's not going to be an awful lot coming up on this trail until we get to something called Liberty Pool shortly. But still, it's one of the ways that you can get to Grotto Geyser. As I'd mentioned before, the other way, and the way that most people take, you can see in several of our other virtual Yellowstone tours. You leave the Old Faithful area and just continue straight down on the first trail that you see ahead of you. And that will take you past some of Yellowstone's major geysers. The first one that you come to is Castle Geyser, and as I mention it, I'm zooming in on Castle Geyser. You get a lot closer to it on the other trail that I mentioned. You'll notice all the sinter around us. The sinter is that white stuff, and that gets brought up from underground by the thermal features, particularly the geysers when they erupt. But I was telling you about Castle. There are 5, what I like to refer to as 5 major geysers, or the big 5 geysers in the upper geyser basins, and these geysers have their eruption times predicted. You've got Old Faithful, you've got Castle, you've got Grand Geyser, which we're going to be coming to shortly, you've got Riverside Geyser, and you've got Daisy Geyser. And if you take that main trail that I mentioned to you, you'll go from Old Faithful, which is one of the 5, you'll go past Castle, and you'll then come to the turnoff to the Daisy Group of Geysers, which you can also see in another one of our virtual Yellowstone tours. We have several of our virtual Yellowstone tours of that area, including one that's a pretty cool one that Cami, who used to be our manager here in 2007, that she and I did on a day when it was really freezing and there was a lot of snow around. So check out those videos as well. You will then come to Grotto Geyser, and just past Grotto Geyser is the turnoff to Riverside Geyser, which is another one of the 5 geysers in the upper geyser basin that do get predicted. There's one other geyser that regularly has its eruption times predicted, and that's not in the upper geyser basin. Look at that pool over there. You'll notice the colors. Compare it to this one, which looked so much more clean and blue and doesn't have those bright reds and maroons and oranges. And that geyser that we saw on the right, that hot spring, I meant hot springs and not geysers, but that hot spring is actually dying, and that's Castle Geyser again. That hot spring is dying because as it gets cooler and cooler, so more and more organisms are able to survive in there, and it becomes more and more colorful. And as I mentioned to you in one of the videos we did of Morning Glory Pool, and this over here is Liberty Pool. As I mentioned to you in one of the videos we did of Morning Glory, the reason that it is as colorful as it is that it is unfortunately dying. What happens is that the plumbing, the pipes that bring the water up from underground, become constricted, and the source of heat and the source of water gets cut off. Now, this can happen naturally. One of the ways is from all the earthquakes that we get in this area. But also what happens is that people, although they know that they're not supposed to, throw things into the geysers and into the hot pools. And Sinter adheres really quickly to even a very small pebble or a coin that you may throw in. And relatively speaking, in no time, the item that has been thrown in becomes bigger and bigger and bigger, and it eventually starts to clog up the plumbing that's bringing the water and the heat that I mentioned before. Now, going straight here would take us past Grand Geyser, but I always like to take this little detour to something called Spasmodic Pool, which is Spasmodic Geyser, which is one of my favorite geysers in the upper geyser basin. You'll notice that Spasmodic has 2 pools, or 2 craters, as they are called, and it erupts from both of those craters up to about 15 feet high. But what makes Spasmodic even more interesting is that it also has approximately 20 vents in those 2 pools, and they also erupt. And between all of them, although the eruption patterns are irregular, they're generally in the 1 to about 3 hour range. That's Grand Geyser coming up ahead of me, and then to my left, that is Belgian Pool. Isn't that a beautiful pool? It looks a bit like an oyster, and it used to be called Oyster Pool before a tourist from Belgium fell in there and unfortunately died. and it was renamed Belgian Pool. Now, Grand Geyser, you'll recall, is one of the 5 major geysers in Yellowstone which have their eruption times predicted. You've got, once again, Grand, Old Faithful, Riverside, Daisy, and Castle Geyser. Now, where we are looking, just below where you see those snags, and a snag is a standing dead tree, but you can see Grand Geyser, or you can see its pool anyway. Grand Geyser is a fountain geyser, and it is the world's currently highest geyser that can be predicted. I know Steamboat Geyser, which is also in Yellowstone, is higher, but its eruption times cannot be predicted. What is one of the most cool aspects of Grand Geyser? Well, there's a number of them. Number one, it almost always has an encore performance, and the second time it erupts is even higher than the first time. And secondly, right next to Grand are turbine and vent geysers, and those go off together with Grand. I timed my trip from the Old Faithful area to Grotto to be in the vicinity of Grand when it was predicted to erupt, and I'll just show you a very little bit of it here. Remember that you can see a lot more of this Grand Geyser eruption as well as several other Grand Geyser eruptions in our YouTube channel and also at virtualyellowstonetours.com. I'm leaving the Grand Group of Geysers now after Grand had finished erupting, but you'll notice how Vent Geyser on the left, the larger one, and Turbine Geyser are still erupting. Vent and Turbine can continue erupting for an hour, even longer, after Grand has finished its eruption. I mentioned the Grand Group of Geysers. You may have seen our virtual Yellowstone tour on the Daisy Group of Geysers, and the Geyser Group is named after the main geyser in that area. Here, of course, you have Grand Geyser, you've got Vent Geyser, you've got Turbine Geyser. Let's see, you've got West Triplet Geyser, you've got Rift Geyser, but the 3 main ones are Grand, Vent, and Turbine, and that, for the most part, is what people come to see. After a geyser has erupted, particularly a geyser like Grand, you can expect to see people streaming away in the boardwalk in both directions. The direction I'm going now is, of course, towards Grotto Geyser, but going back the other way, we would, of course, return to the Old Faithful area. There's any number of beautiful hot springs and pools and other thermal features in this area lying amongst the center that I mentioned to you. Unfortunately, in this part of Yellowstone, so many of them appear to be dying, and they've got the warmer color that I've mentioned to you. This is Wave Spring coming up, and once again, you'll notice how you don't really see the blues and grays that you'll see in a very healthy geyser. A very healthy hot spring, because presumably it's not getting enough hot water, not enough heat or enough water coming up from underground. This coming up on my right is Beauty Pool. It's one of 2 really, if you'll excuse me using the word again, beautiful pools, beautiful hot springs in this part of Yellowstone. The other one we're going to see in a moment is called Chromatic Pool.
No, Daddy, move.
One of the interesting things about Beauty Pool and the nearby Chromatic Pool is that they are actually connected. And we can see this when the water rises in one pool, it drops in another. So if, for example, there's an increase of water in chromatic, then the water in beauty is going to go down. And these increases and decreases can take place over a period of several weeks, leading up to even a couple of years, and this is chromatic pool. The interconnection of the two hot springs is not unusual in the Yellowstone context. Consider Grand Geyser, Vent, and Turbine Geyser, which we saw a few minutes ago, and how when Grand erupts, Vent and Turbine also erupt, showing some form of interconnectivity there. And then I've mentioned in several of our virtual Yellowstone tours that the world's highest geyser, Steamboat Geyser, is connected underground to Sistan Spring. I like to tell the story about how I arrived there one day, and it was pretty early in the morning, maybe around 6:15, 6:30 in August, and things just seemed not quite the same as when I'd been to Steamboat before, and I've never seen Steamboat erupt. There seemed to be a lot more moisture, a lot more water droplets in the air. And it was early in the morning, as I say again. This is the Firehole River that we're going to be crossing. And so some of the droplets were actually ice. And I wondered if I'd just missed a steamboat eruption overnight. So I continued on down the boardwalk towards Sistan Spring, and you'll see when you go to Steamboat that the boardwalk continues down several flights of stairs, and then you'll get to Sistan Spring, which is a beautiful hot pool surrounded by dead trees because the sinter has eaten up at the roots and then the trunk of the trees. And sure enough, Sistan Pool was basically empty, and it was in the process of refilling itself, showing that Steamboat had indeed erupted overnight. And of course, the only downside was I was sorry that I hadn't seen it erupt. Steamboat went through a period when its eruptions were anywhere from about 3 days to 70, that's right, 70 years. But in recent years, it started to erupt a lot more frequently than was previously the case. Now, coming up on our right, not over there, but where I had the camera pointed a moment ago, that is Giant Geyser and the Giant Group of Geysers, the main constituents of which are, of course, Giant, and then just on the other side of Giant you've got Bijou Geyser, there's Mastiff Geyser, and there is Turtle Geyser. Now, Giant goes for very long periods between eruptions. I believe that there were 2 eruptions in 2010, there was one in 2015, there was one in 2019. You'll see in a moment, in fact you can see from that picture, how Giant is basically split into 2. And Giant Geyser is such a powerful geyser that during one of its eruptions, it actually ripped itself apart. I've never been lucky enough to see Giant Geyser erupt myself, but according to National Park Service resources, it's apparently a really impressive geyser, which you can only imagine, noting that it has blown itself apart during the course of eruptions in the past. That is Giant on the right there, and that is Bijou Geyser on the left. Giant eruptions generally last about an hour, and they can reach heights of about 250 feet, which is somewhere around 76 meters. During a Giant Geyser eruption, the smaller geysers that are close to Giant can also erupt at the same time, and that's not altogether surprising, noting the interconnection between the thermal features that I had previously mentioned to you. In fact, that on the left is the main trail between Old Faithful and Morning Glory, and I was just about to tell you that, in fact, a giant eruption, infrequent as it is, when it does occur, it generally occurs during the so-called hot period, immediately following the start of a Grotto Geyser eruption. And that's Grotto Geyser coming up ahead of me, so we're very close to the main trail that runs between Old Faithful and Morning Glory. Grotto is a very impressive geyser, as you'll see in a minute. It is a cone geyser, as you can see for yourselves, and its cone is nearly 8 feet high, and it does have a very odd shape, and that has come over the years from sinter, and you'll recall I've mentioned sinter to you several times before, from the sinter accumulating over dead tree stumps as Grotto erupted. Grotto geysers' eruption times are not predicted, but they do occur approximately every 8 hours, although the times between eruptions can be longer after a bigger eruption. One of the beauties about Grotto is that its eruptions can last for over a day. Unfortunately, I've come to the end of another one of our virtual Yellowstone tours. If you enjoy our virtual Yellowstone tour series, please consider giving us a thumbs up and subscribing to our channel. Thank you.